I'm afraid the challenge to present 3,000 years of history in 1 hour is beyond me and beyond anybody I know. So what I will try to do is first give you some general comments to trace the contour, the framework within which that history developed, some major characteristics. Then go very quickly over some of the important periods, the development of the Armenian people, the major problems in that history, and finally come to the modern period, present time, and see whether we can make sense of the present in light of what we've talked about before. First, some notions about geography. I wish I had a larger map, but there's a map. This isn't exactly a map, just a sketch. This is the Black Sea. Here you'd have the Mediterranean Sea, and this is the Caspian Sea. So just to give you a general idea of where this territory is located, here you find the Caucasus Mountains, and in terms of modern-day territories, to give you a general idea, this is the eastern Mediterranean coast. This is Asia Minor, Turkey, Syria, and then down Lebanon and Israel, to the North African coast, Egypt, etc. The coast of the southern coast of the Black Sea would continue to go to the Straits, Constantinople or modern Istanbul. Russia proper would be north of the Caucasus, and here in the south you would find today Syria, Iraq, and then Persia. Now, in this general region is located historical Armenia, of which we will be talking mostly today. Besides Armenians, today you will find the Georgians and Azerbaijani Turks. So it is a plateau, it's a high plateau, and it has been in contact from the beginning with the various continents, various regions. It is not very easy to travel through, particularly in the old times, but nevertheless, the people have found ways to get through it, over it, and anything else. It is at times possible to see that when there has been peace, generally speaking, in the region, this Armenian plateau does provide routes for trade, and it has in the past. For example, in the Achaemenid period, before the Parthian dynasty in Persia, this is before the 2nd, 3rd century BC, there was one highway, for example, known as the Imperial or the Royal Highway, which stretched all the way from the capital city of Susa or Shusha, all the way to the coast, which was quite a feat at that time, and this was mainly for trade and military purposes. Other than that, trade has gone between the Mediterranean cities and the North Caucasus region, China, India, Persia, Armenia, to the west. Now, in the ancient times, you know, the civilized world was the Mediterranean, so Armenia itself is not right around the Mediterranean, although at one point there will be an Armenian kingdom here in the Middle Ages, rather this whole region, but it has always been on the outskirts of major civilizations, this being ancient Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates where civilization grew. Armenia was right north of that, and it has participated in the major events such as the Neolithic Revolution, the urban revolution, etc. Now, the winters are quite cold, as you might have seen on TV lately. This is the earthquake area that has hit all three parts of that region. That is the Turkish, Soviet, and Persian part. The winters are quite cold, and in the summer you have a very dry weather. The second important element is that we're dealing with a history that is really ancient and at the same time very modern, in the sense that it goes back approximately 1,000 years before Christ, where we know these people, what they did more or less, and of course as time goes on we know more. As a political entity, as an Armenia as such, its history is basically before 1000 AD. So the first 2,000 years Armenia is a state, a political entity, more or less strong, capable of defending itself, or at least worthy of being an ally to the others, and therefore it's very much part of history. This includes the two major periods in world civilization of the ancient imperial type governments to the feudal type of society that you find first in this region and then in Europe, and finally the modern period with all the problems that it has. So it really takes, if not at least some cleverness on the part of the mind to really absorb everything that is going on, because we're too used to understanding things within our own frame of mind. And therefore, as I go through this, I hope you'll remember some aspects of world civilization, which I'm sure you all know. So it will help place this development. Now, it's not only an academic issue. The reason why I stress this is not because I learned it in college, or which I didn't, but or that the professor requires that anybody wanting a PhD in Armenian history know all of history. It's just that 3,000 years of history is a lot of weight on anybody who finds or feels himself or herself Armenian today. It also has a lot of implications for the type of nationalism that Armenians have, which has often been confused with other types of nationalism. And it is very relevant because that type of nationalism is what is the basis of Armenians' attitudes toward integration today in American society or any other society, or toward of their attitudes toward their own culture. Now, so this whole period that we're looking at is not only a quantitative development, but also a qualitative one which explains not everything, obviously, but much of what Armenians feel and do today in terms of their association with a certain ethnic group. The third point is that being at the crossroads of many civilizations, Armenian culture has first evolved. That is, it has come into contact with other cultures, and it has had to find responses to its problems, to new problems of external threat as well as internal evolution of society. Now, throughout history, we find that in the ancient times, and I will go into this a little further, I'll just give you an idea today. You had the Assyrian kingdom, for example, right after during the Mesopotamian, early Mesopotamian civilizations, the Assyrian kingdoms, and then a kingdom of Urartu in the north. Armenians were not Armenians as yet. They didn't call themselves Armenians. They called themselves something else. But this whole region was in conflict with the most powerful nation in the world at that time, Assyria. Then the balance shifted with the coming of the Medes, etc. But the point is, right after that, it is possible to see the development of the civilized world as a struggle between the East and the West. The East being the various Persian dynasties that came and went, and the West being first the Greek world, and then the Roman world, and then the Byzantine world, and then Western Europe. And in the 19th and 20th century, the East eventually was replaced by the Persia as representative of the East was replaced by Russia. Therefore, you have all the major cultures of the world politically often struggling for this region because it is a four-way street, and also, obviously, culturally affecting it. And therefore, the development of Armenian culture is not something that is explained in itself, but it has to be explained by the adjustments it makes, the adaptations it has of these various other cultures with which it comes into contact. Now, before I go into a more chronological approach, I'd like to give you an idea of what we use to know what happened in Armenia as sources. Like any other people, first you have rock cave decorations, cave drawings from 30,000, 40,000 years ago that still exist and are being explored today. Secondly, you have rock inscriptions during the Mesopotamian civilizations, whether it's a cuneiform or different symbolic signs, and these are important sources for our understanding of the period, for example, from 1000 BC on to the time of Christ. And not only inscriptions that are made by people in Armenia itself, but also by neighboring peoples who came and conquered and or did not, whatever. It is part of that history, so it helps us to look at those inscriptions. Then we come to the written sources. These written sources include both Persian sources, for example, and Roman and Greek sources. Greek sources, one of the generals from Greece traveled to Persia to meddle in the affairs of the Persian dynastic wars, and he passed through Armenia 401 BC, and he has descriptions of life in Armenia, of the rural communes, of what people eat and drink, and who was governing there. So later on, Roman historians will delve on Armenia because it becomes an important boundary for the Roman Empire in its struggle with the East, that is Persia. So they do write about who is in Armenia, what these people are doing, etc. Then, of course, for the middle period in Armenian history, let's say from the 5th century on to the 16th century, basically we rely on Armenian chroniclers, Armenian monks in monasteries who sat down and wrote the history of their times, often Armenian princes paying bishops or learned men to sit down and write the history of their own family. So these are sources which are used. Of course, none of these sources are acceptable as they are. You have, as in any other history, you have to develop your techniques to understand what you can take and what you have to be more careful about. And then, of course, in the 16th, 17th century, printed matter, first Bibles and then journals, newspapers, to the present time, which, of course, are supplemented by governmental archives in different countries which did rule over part or all of Armenia. Now, the first period of Armenian history is actually the pre-Armenian history of the land that was known as Urartu. Excavations are still going on in the region which was covered by this government, so that our knowledge of it is still increasing. This Urartu kingdom existed from approximately 9th to the 6th century BC. These are people, mostly local, basically tribal organization, and it is called kingdom because at one point, one of those tribal chiefs is able not to organize a state as we know it today, but to bring those tribes together, allow them local autonomy, but then take care of foreign affairs and the military establishment, so that it is not a totally integrated society. There are valleys and mountains that are separated from each other, and often you have language barriers, language that is not the modern Armenian. Eventually, during this period, and starting quite earlier than that, we will see that in the European peoples that were coming from the north and the west, and that such as the Etruscans, etc., that moved over Greece, Italy, etc., some of these people moved to the Armenian plateau, gradually were absorbed by the people. These were not military conquerors. Rather, they were conquered militarily by the Urartian kings, and yet the language and the level of culture of the incoming people was slightly higher, so that although militarily conquered, they were able to put an imprint on the local culture. And it is in the 6th century BC that for the first time we find the name Armenia mentioned in a Persian rock inscription. So from the 6th century on, we have a people that are known as the Armenians and a land that is known as Armenia. Now, in parentheses, I should say that Armenians do not call their land Armenia. Armenians call their land Hayastan. And they call themselves not Armenian, but Hay. And one of the reasons for this is that the incoming people were mostly Armens, and the land came to be known by the name Armen, while the local people call themselves Hay, so that both names survive in history. This is what Armenians call themselves and their land, and this is what non-Armenians recognize that land as being Armenian. All right. Now, as I said, the Urartian kingdom is a group of tribes, actually, almost forced into the domination of one single king, and it is in constant battle with, as I said earlier, the kingdom of Assyria that has taken over the ancient city-states of Mesopotamia, quite strong, quite brutal, and we find practically hundreds of Assyrian inscriptions saying such and such king went to the land of the north, the people of Van and the people of Urartu, and conquered the land. And often this has been taken as an actual conquest by Assyria, except that logically speaking, it is difficult to see why you would have to reconquer their land a year after you conquered it once. And when this happens regularly, the mind easily goes to other deductions. That is, these were not actual conquests. There was a continuous battle going on, and it is not very clear as to, although the Assyrians had supremacy, but the Urartians had developed a guerrilla warfare tactic whereby they would ambush Assyrian troops at their own will in the land they knew better than the Assyrians did. They also had spies in Assyria, as the Assyrians had spies in Urartu, and they would send messages to their kings as to the movements of the Urartian or Assyrian forces. So it was quite a developed warfare, which lasted till both were exhausted and both dynasties collapsed. These dynasties were replaced by what is known in history a major Persian dynasty, the the Achaemenids, that not only ruled over what was Assyria, but also reached all the way to the Mediterranean coast and to the Aegean Sea. These people governed their lands differently. They divided into provinces, and they had local governors ruling over different places. And by this time we know it is Armenia already. Urartians don't exist. The different races have mixed to produce the Armenian people. And this region is divided into two parts with two different governors. And it is in the 2nd century BC, around 198, that as a result of the rise of the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, we find the Achaemenid rule almost destroyed, and an Armenian king declares independence, and this is the first independent state of Armenia around 198, and which brings us to the next period of Armenian history, 200 years right before Christ, when Armenia is a state. It is, yeah.
Just to clarify, the original tribal people of Armenia, were they a nomadic group that came from like Rome or Greece or Mesopotamia or wherever? I don't understand who these people really
Well, the people who were here have been here to the best of our knowledge as far as we know. We see no movement of people. As far as history takes us back, this land has been inhabited by the local people. Only starting with the what is called in history the peoples of the sea. In the 12th century BC, you have the different smaller tribes coming in, establishing and then mixing up with the locals, and then evolving into the Armenian people. All right, then the 2 centuries before Christ is in Armenia. We have an Armenian state with very important kings, quite powerful, able to compete at some points with the Roman Empire, and even fighting it. This is the strongest period of Armenian history in terms of its political, in terms of its international value. It negotiates, as I said, with Rome as well as with the new Persian emperors. It has quite a few battles with the Romans, and it is said that at one point, when one of the important kings, whom I will talk about later, known as Dicran, or in Latin sources, Dicranus, this guy, at the beginning of the 1st century BC, had become an emperor on his own. He had conquered not only Armenia itself, gotten rid of all the small tribal chiefs as political powers, created a centralized government with complete authority, but he had also extended his borders to include parts of Persia, most of this Caspian coast, all the way to the Caucasus Mountains, to the Black Sea, down to what is today Israel, Lebanon, Syria. So it was a huge empire, but this happened only when the Romans were quite weak and they had their own internal wars, particularly slave revolts around 70 BC. And the Persians were weak too. So during one of those battles with the Romans, it is said that the Emperor Dicranus, who used to mount on his horse with 4 kings at his service, he looked at the Roman soldiers coming in the field from atop a fortress, and he wondered if these are messengers, it's too large a group. If these are soldiers, then it's too small an army. Well, he hadn't been exposed to the concept of legions, the Roman legions that were quite well organized, and he lost the battle and his empire, although the kingdom survived in the basic circle that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, after the loss of this kingdom, we have the rise of another one, which becomes very much the victim of, again, the Roman imperialism and Persian Yes. Well, it was lost as a result of the fight between these people, as both empires, the Persian and the Roman, tried to control it. They tried to control the throne itself and who was going to be sitting on the throne. So there was a period of instability, as a result of which the throne itself was lost. That instability continued for another 50 years till the Romans and the Persians came to an agreement. The agreement was that the Persians would appoint the king, the Romans would have to approve it. So a new type of political system evolved, a kingdom whose right to the throne was not from his own people, but from foreign powers, and this kingdom was not very strong, although it lasted till the 5th century AD. But by this time, since the central authority wasn't strong, you have local nobility, generals and other families that acquire such importance that by the 5th century, Armenia is a feudal state. The Romans and the Persians, again coming to conflict, divide Armenia totally. There is no more Armenian state. Bulk of it, half of it goes to the Romans, and then of course it is the Byzantine Empire by this time in the West, and the other goes to the Persians. So the kingdom is lost, the statehood is lost, although the culture continues and continues to exist. And more importantly, in the 5th century, it produces a golden age, what is known in Armenian history as the golden age of that cultural development. Two things happen. With the loss of political independence, there is more emphasis on culture, number one. Number two, at the end of the kingdom itself, around the beginning of the 4th century, the king had accepted Christianity as the state religion of Armenia. And this is approximately about 10 years before Emperor Constantine in Rome made Christianity a tolerable religion. In Armenia, it was the state religion, obligatory, and this changed the whole outlook of Armenia and had very serious repercussions in the sense that eventually, this whole region became Muslim dominated. When the Turks took over Asia Minor by the 15th century, this whole region became Muslim. Most people became Muslim. The Azerbaijanis became Muslim, the Persians became Muslim, and the Mesopotamians became Muslim. So Armenia was left as the only Christian population in the region. And as Christianity that was born here, as a sect in the Eastern Mediterranean, became the state religion of the Roman Empire and conquered as a religion all of the West, then the cultural traditions being tied to the Bible, which are most important also in terms of the historical development, that is, how do you interpret history? Well, Christians interpret it differently than the Muslims. So there developed between Armenians and Westerners a very strong attachment. From the 4th century on, and particularly in the 5th century, Armenians looked to the West to improve their own knowledge of the world and everything else. In the 5th century also, another important event that occurred, with the loss of political independence, again, as I said, there was an emphasis on cultural development, and one of the priests, very close to the king, the last king, decided that Armenians needed an alphabet of their own if they are going to survive as a cultural unit. And if they're going to claim to be anything other than just a tribal unit that is finished at
the process of nation building that had started 6th century or even 9th century BC, and he developed this might develop an Armenian alphabet of 36 letters, and for this he went to local sources. He went to all the major learning centers that existed at the time, including Alexandria, which was an important bishopric, and Asia towns in Asia Minor, where there were universities, and he came up with these 36 letters, which are still used as the alphabet of the Armenians. So all these came to a fruition in the 5th century when you basically have the beginning of Armenian culture, the translation of the Bible in a very highly literary style, in classical Armenian language, from where people started discussing religious issues, dogmatic issues, and then you have the chroniclers, people who start writing a history of Armenia. And when a people starts writing the history of itself, it reflects a certain self-consciousness, consciousness of its own importance, and the importance of its own achievement. And this was done in the case of the Armenians for the first time in the 5th century AD. And although a lot of the facts related by this particular historian in the 5th century AD are disputed and have been disputed for the last 50, 100 years, the image of Armenians of themselves is very closely tied to that 5th century first Armenian historian who thought about writing the history of all the Armenian people since the beginning of time. Now, in the feudal type of society existed even under the Arabs. You know, in the 7th century, the religion of Islam arose and first conquered the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and eventually became a prolific challenge to the Byzantine Empire. And now instead of Islam, we have the Islamic Arab Empire fighting with the Byzantine Empire. And part of this struggle was over this territory of Armenia, which eventually was overtaken by the Arabs, ruled for about 200 years, and here we find for the first time that the local nobility that had replaced the kings as the local power base starts losing its grip on the land, because these noblemen often try to revolt against the Arabs, and at times they make it for a few months and then they lose again. And every time they lose, the Arab caliph or the emperor decimates and nobility, the nobility of a region or another. So, and also this is the first time we find an attempt on the part of a foreign country not only to control, which had been done before, but also to move other nationalities into Armenia. And in this case, it was some Arab people that were moved there. Now, with the weakening of the Arab Empire itself, the new vitality that comes into Armenia is with all the approximately 300 huge nobility that we were prior to the coming of the Arabs that had divided Armenia among themselves. Now we have 3-4 major families, because the others are decimated, the land is redistributed. We have 3-4 major feudal lords who are able to agree and create a new kingdom in the 9th century. 9th to 11th century, you have the revival of the new kingdom. More importantly, this kingdom is organized such that it is moving from the feudal structures into a what is recognized today as an urban development. It is not centered in the cultural communes or large feudal ownerships or land ownership, but rather in the cities which are built by the kings, financed by the kings, that have churches, markets, you even have labor unions, in the sense of medieval unions, guilds of workers who are able to defend their own rights.
Living for all of the people, but they use it to acquire nuclear weapons, they use it to acquire all kinds of modern machinery, I don't know to fight whom, except to survive as oppressing powers in their own lands. Now, so that we find that Armenian society was able, because of its history, to come out of the state of slavery that it had accepted throughout the centuries to become a revolutionary force, and that's where it lost. Now, this is, generally speaking, a second type of interpretation, which starts looking from the inside to the outside, along with the attitudes, for example, toward the oppressing power, that is the Ottomans, that had changed by the 19th century. We find that Armenian society changed internally as well. When the kingdoms were lost, that is, the Armenian state was lost, what remained of anything of Armenian political value was the church. The Armenian church, a very national church, that is, it had no legal ties with outside churches, and the Armenian clergy, of course, became those elements in society that kept the culture going, and also that provided any kind of a unity among Armenians when the land itself was divided, when there was not enough economic and social development to bring all of them together in any way. The church remained the only one that did. Yes?
Can I just ask a quick question about the church? You mentioned it had no political tie with any other church. Wasn't it ever connected with the whole Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox?
No. It is not legally or in any way connected.
Is it the same?
It is not. It is a separate church. It accepts the dogma of the Eastern churches, not the Russian Orthodox, but the Ethiopian church, the Coptic church in Egypt. There are 4 Eastern churches that are separate, have the same dogma, but organizationally they are separate.
Did they break away from Rome at the same time?
Yes, they broke away not from Rome, but from the church itself in 451 at the Council of Chalcedon, when the major tenets of the church itself, the universal church, were set. There were some things that the Armenians could not accept, so from then on they separated. All right, so what happened then is that by 18th century, 19th century, Armenian society was a religion-oriented society. It was defined as a religion, as a religious community by the Ottoman government. It understood itself to be a religious community, and an Armenian was anyone who belonged to the Armenian Apostolic National Church. But eventually, through the activities of European and American missionaries, the Catholic Church started making inroads. The Protestant Church started making inroads among Armenians. Furthermore, because of the extended educational facilities that Armenians provided for themselves in the 18th and 19th centuries, the whole mentality grew, defining Armenians not by church, but by culture, by language, and consequently, the Armenian community that had been organized around the churches started organizing itself around political parties, and eventually revolutionary parties, which became the more important force in the Armenian community. After 1915, after the First World War, that changed again. That changed again because when Armenians had to move out,
those who survived, at least the other communities, again, the only thing that united them was the church, and it's possible to say that today the church has regained its primary position in the Armenian community. All right. I wanted to give these some time to expound on these two possible interpretations so that we realize we're not dealing with a group of people that are thrown right and left by major powers, that have no life of their own, that have no evolution of their own, but that learn eventually to live and survive and create their own world and their own values. Now, what I will be doing is going over those few thousand years a little more carefully, with a little more detail than I did, so that we have a clearer picture. Now, the major period of formation of the Armenian nation is down to the 6th century BC. 6th century BC. There are signs in Armenia, all kinds of archaeological proofs that people had been living in those lands in an organized way for at least 40,000 years. 40,000 years. It was basically a tribal society that had its own local chiefs. It is very possible, and there is no reason to think otherwise. It's very possible that the evolution of organized society followed the same anthropological laws that other societies did. That is, you move from a hunting and gathering society to an agricultural society, and the agricultural revolution, that is the settled planting and harvesting of seeds that occurred at this time in Mesopotamia, immediately reached Armenia, and therefore once people were able to settle down, they evolved more complex social relations. Now, these tribal peoples fought each other as anybody else did, but it seems by 2500 BC it is much more so, and by 12 there are ethnic coalitions that are going on. That is, groups of tribes, not necessarily mixing with each other racially, but working together for against common enemies, coalescing against common dangers. In the 12th century BC, we find that there are some peoples that move, as far as that can be determined, from the Balkan area, that move into Asia Minor, move also into Greece, and start spreading in the civilized world. It is these people that are known as the peoples of the sea in Egyptian wall carvings. And some of these people end up in Armenia itself, where they bring with them a more complex system of social organization than what existed in Armenia. And although they are not powerful enough to militarily conquer the local peoples, the Urartians, culturally they seem to be superior, and eventually it is the mixture, basically, of the various local tribes, the Urartuans, and the incoming tribes, the Armenians, that mix together to produce culturally, ethnically, and racially, to produce what is known as the Armenian nation. You might be interested to know that Armenians do not call themselves Armenians. They call themselves Hais. Hai is an Armenian, in Armenia. And the land of Armenia is Hayastan. Now, possibly the reason for this is that there was, right under the Black Sea, a region where there was a very strong kingdom known as the kingdom of Hayassan.
And it is, this kingdom survived long enough, and it must have had quite an impact culturally on the surrounding Urartian tribes, that eventually local people had started identifying themselves as Hais or Hayasa, which became Hayastan through linguistic changes, while foreigners or non-Armenians recognized those tribes that came from overseas and mixed with the Armenians. Therefore, they recognized that land as the land of Armenia or Armena or Armenia, and Armenians as Armenians. All right, so that we are dealing with the same people, but the components of this new nation had their impact on what Armenians call themselves and what non-Armenians call themselves. The formation process, therefore, indicates to a large extent the future cultural development of the Armenian people. That is, there were many similarities between the Armenians and a few other smaller tribes that came into the Armenian plateau and those that went, for example, into Greece, into Asia Minor. Their arts, their dresses often coincide very closely. And therefore there was, from the beginning, and perhaps one might call it a natural sympathy for what was in the West. Now, after the, down to, one might say, 1st century BC, this formation process is coming to its end, number one. Number two, Armenia seems to be very much part of the Iranian world, Iranian outlook under the Persian Empire. But as the local governors of Armenia, the local rulers, try to get away from Persian rule, they find a natural ally in the West that comes in the form of the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. And it is these local rulers that, for the first time, for example, in 189, having acquired a lot of autonomy from the Shahs, the king of kings of Iran, of Persia, declare their independence and start the Armenian state as we know it. This is the beginning of it, and this dynasty, which is an important dynasty, educated and open in the Greek centers of the world, and that means either Edessa, Urfa, or Alexandria in Egypt. These were the main centers of learning. These were the kings who ruled over Armenia for about 200 years, till the fighting between these two came too much for them. We have one king, for example, during this period, who's known as Dikran or Dikranes, who might be the only man in history to have made the encyclopedia, just because he conquered a lot of lands. That's the criteria we are used to, aren't we? Well, he was able to use the time when the Romans had slave revolts on their hands, and the Persians were similarly too busy fighting each other for the throne, to himself start conquering and creating, carving out an empire for himself. And now Armenians are quite proud of this fact. I don't know why, but an empire was much too much for any Armenian leader to hold at that time. We might have been much better off had we made fortresses to defend what we had. And forget about imperialistic ventures. But see, we are not dealing with the national causes in the 1st century, 2nd century BC. It is our present outlook that the lost causes which we try to revive in history, which makes us feel proud of an Armenian emperor. But this emperor was not fighting for Armenia, obviously. Like all emperors, there he was fighting for his dynasty, for himself, for his power and harem. And believe me, he had it. I mean, not fortunately, not all Armenians are saints. All right, so what we have had enough of those.
All right. A second interesting man during this dynasty is Ardavast. And Ardavast is interesting not because he conquered, but because he spent his time, fortunately or unfortunately, writing poetry and tragedies and watching plays being performed. Once in a while he went to war, but this he enjoyed most. And it is this king who got in trouble with, you won't believe this, but Cleopatra, because it is the time of the Roman conquest, etc., and they came and took Armenia as well. And Antony was very upset because the general that preceded him could not conquer Armenia or Persia. He had to go back to Cleopatra with some victory. So he told Ardavast that he was going to come to Armenia to talk about future plans, and he did. And then he got Ardavast and his wife and family to come to Egypt, Alexandria, and where very generously Antony bestowed the crown of Armenia over their 4-year-old kid. The poor kid never set foot in Armenia, but this story also goes that when Antony, having considered himself the emperor of the world now, organized a parade to divide the world to his favorites. And he was parading also the conquered kings. And supposedly King Ardavast was in chains, golden chains. Of course, kings still respect kings with his family. And everybody that passed in front of Cleopatra was supposed to bow and pay respects, and Ardavast refused to do so. He might have been dazzled by the beauty or whatever it was, he refused to bow his head. And then, so they got his head. But anyway, this dynasty was not able to survive a very strong and harsh competition for the control of the civilized world, as I said at the beginning, between Persia and Rome. The next important period is a period of confusion where Rome and Persia tried to control the crown of Armenia, sometimes by allowing no king, and at other times trying to force their own candidates on the kingdom. And anytime Armenians don't like one, they get rid of him, but they don't have enough force to put their own man, till finally the two empires are tired. They come to an agreement that the Roman emperor will appoint the Armenian king, and the Persian emperor will have to give his okay for the job. Eventually, a new dynasty comes up that rules down to the 5th century, and this is the period that I talked about the rise of the feudal system in Armenia, where the king has less and less power, and regional lords acquire more and more power. And one of the reasons is that both Rome and Persia try to get a weak king so that he cannot fight their own plans. Now, again, looking from the 20th century, we find that the feudal system was an extremely damaging one for national unity, for the state, etc. But we must not forget that we are living in the feudal world at this time. That is the time I'm talking about. And in the feudal world, again, there is no concept of nation as we know it today. They only refer to it or have recourse to it when they want all the people to participate in a war that is led by feudal lords. And feudal lords have no allegiances to the people, obviously. They're not there for their good, they're not elected. They're there for their own family, for their own lands. And often Armenian lords, as feudal lords in Europe will be doing, they prefer to have a king to be vassals of a Persian king who's hundreds of miles away, rather than a strong Armenian king who's next door. So that the weakness of the Armenian state is very much related to this feudal development. Now, another important development from the 1st to the 5th century is the acceptance of Christianity as a state religion. Now, it is very difficult to assess the impact of this at the time or today. Now, there are various criteria which can be used to do this. For example, the association, the acceptance of Christianity by a nation sitting in the mountains here was obviously a beneficial factor immediately, in the sense that because of the crumbling world in which they were living, the state was losing its power, the kingdom was lost. A new religion was an important factor that would provide for some coherence among all Armenians, and also would become a battle cry to resist oppressors. Now, at this time, in this century, the 4th century, beginning of 4th century BC, we have most of the civilized world being invaded by Christians. And so it wasn't an oddity, particularly when a few years later the Roman Empire accepted that same religion. So it became also eventually a very strong cultural link with the West, which, as the more progressive of societies eventually, provided for channels between Armenians and Westerners to develop ideas, to develop identity along Western lines, and to create this sympathy for Western peoples, Western culture, Western civilization. But at the same time, when you look at it from, let's say, the point of view of the 15th century, 16th century, what has happened by this time is that in the 7th century, 8th century, Islamic religion rose, and it took over most of the peoples of the Near East. With the coming of the Turks to Asia Minor, this region became controlled by Muslims. And the Muslim religion, particularly after the 13th and 14th century, being a stagnant religion. It is not the religion, but the way people looked at it, because it was a very lively, strong, and moving religion, till they decided that it shouldn't be so. By the 16th century, the small Christian nation was now surrounded by non-Christians. And if you realize that in the Islamic religion and state are not separated. It is the same man. It is the same concept. Muhammad started as a prophet, and he built a community. And for the protection of his community, he had to have an army. And therefore, he was both religious and secular ruler. And the Islamic mentality and philosophy did not accept a separation of these two functions. Early in a Christian world, we find that same thing. Except that in Christian society, you had the Roman Empire, which had an emperor, where religion was downplayed. So that eventually, when society became too complex in Western Europe, by the 13th, 14th century, you find people like Dante putting the popes in the 8th floor of heaven, and telling that politics is not the business of the church. And eventually that will prevail. The church will be set aside, and it is the secular rulers who will take over. But this did not happen in Islamic society. And they still had a hard time in the Arab countries coming to terms with a secular authority separate from religious authority. Now, when we consider then that we have Islamic societies both in Persia and Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, that cannot accept a state that does not have the dominant religion, then you realize that anybody, Christian or Jew, and these are the two major religions that are in the Ottoman Empire, and in the case of Persia, we have the old fire worshippers. These people are not regarded as part of the society. There are special taxes for them, there are special discriminatory laws against them, and therefore, the fact that Armenians were Christians worked against them. Now, I don't know what to do with this fact. Perhaps Armenians should have been Muslims, but there is not this type of discussion that leads to an understanding of history. What I know is that it has worked both in favor and against, but most importantly, when we're trying to understand what happened in history,
It is not by our own likes and dislikes that we have to decide what people did at that time. All right, so the acceptance of Christianity was also accompanied immediately after by the development of the Armenian alphabet, which comes from the 5th century to us. And it is the same alphabet that is used today with the addition of 2 letters that came in the 12th century probably, but a basic alphabet that has 36 letters. 36 letters. Now, often the chroniclers of the period talk about the creation of the alphabet because it was a vision on the part of a monk that brought this alphabet, giving it a divine origin. Armenians did with their alphabet what other peoples have done with their state, with their kings, giving them divine origins. Because after all, there must be some more legitimacy in this world than just your own existence. And because throughout the centuries the alphabet became an extremely important part of the tools by which you keep yourself going, you define yourself at the while you're facing all kinds of dangers and threats and oppression, then the alphabet was elevated to, even immediately then, to the level of something that is divine. All right, now, so what makes this period important, the 5th century, let's say, when we have this new dynasty that is known as the Arshakuni dynasty, is the most important period in terms of the self-concept of the Armenians. Here we have the ethnic and racial formation. Here in the 5th century, 4th century, 5th century, we have the cultural definition of the Armenian, the basic values that will lead Armenian culture and civilization for centuries to come. In the 5th century, for example, for the first time, a monk, a bishop, by the name of Moses, tries to write the history of the Armenian people. Now, writing one's history takes a lot of consciousness, a lot of self-detachment, to put oneself beyond one's life, look back, to feel the need for that kind of history, to define oneself. What are we? Well, that takes a lot of civilization, that is a level of civilization. And one famous statement by this Moses was, that is still used, and that, I don't know what that says about Armenian situation today, but it says, although we are small in number, but we have done deeds that are worthy of great people. And so that perhaps the basic problems right there. In the 5th century it was defined. What are these great deeds? Well, although he talked of Dikran's exploits, it wasn't that he was proud of. He was proud of having accepted a new religion, of having developed a new alphabet, of having translated the Bible, of having developed social values for society that supposedly brought stability and harmony in society. These are the values that Khorenatsi was talking about. And he was also, despite the fact that he was supported, obviously, by the nobility, otherwise no one could afford to write a book in the century, he was critical of that same nobility for having put their own dynastic family interests above the interests of the nation, so that we do have now a larger concept of the nation, which becomes important. Now, what happens after the 5th century? Again, it is the coming of those other empires, and particularly in the 7th century, the Arab Empire, which at the beginning, from the 7th to the 8th century, it's not too bad. What they do is send governors. Governors who collect some taxes. But it's not too bad. They got along. But eventually, as the Arab Empire started losing its income in wars, its expansion started to be limited. Well, the taxes increased, then a lot of soldiers who started giving trouble to the Arab caliphate, caliphs, the Arab kings, because they had nowhere else to go and fight, were sent to Armenia and were settled there. And these became troublesome. And eventually, from the 8th to the 9th century, we have a hardship. There's a change of dynasty, and we have in the Islamic Empire, we have a harsher rule, which provides for intermittent revolts on the parts of the Armenian nobility, Almost every 25 years, there's a revolt against the Arabs. Every time there's a question of succession in the Islamic kingdom, the Armenians revolt. But every time they revolt, they might succeed for a month, they might succeed in a region, but the Arab armies come still harsher. And by this time, the Arabs are using Turkish soldiers, mercenary soldiers, that had been brought down from this region, particularly here, to help the Arab caliphs in Baghdad. So it is these new forces that come to take care of the Armenian nobility, and the way they do it is every time the nobility rises, they decimate that family totally. So that if in the 5th century one could count almost 400 families, major families, of which 50 were great landowners, had great wealth, had their own armies. At any time of the year, each one of those could provide 1,000 to 5,000 soldiers ready to go. And it might not seem big to you, but believe me, in those years, to have 1,000 men fed all year round, armed, was a great feat, and some of them could provide 5,000 at any time. This is not including those they could levy anytime they needed during the summer. Out of those 50 major families, there are only 3 left in the 9th century. The rest have been decimated, the rest have been taken out of circulation. Also, part of the problem is that following the conflict between the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Empire, Byzantium has taken some of Armenia, and what they do here, the Byzantine emperors, they want to have Armenia, they want to have Armenians there, but they don't want to have Armenian nobility there. So what this great emperor does is reform the laws of inheritance. First of all, they decree that the Armenian lands are under military rule, and it is not the Armenian nobility that's going to be in charge of the protection of the frontiers against the Arabs. Secondly, what he decides is that the Armenian law was that when a nobleman died, his eldest son took over the lands. Then the other sons either became bishops or became generals of the army. But the land was not divided. Well, Justinian says now it's going to be divided among all the kids equally, including women. Now, a lot of Byzantine historians view this as a very progressive step for a 6th century emperor. But the fact is, he did not require this for the Greek families, he required it for Armenian families, so that in 3 generations, there was no single family that was in charge of, that owned large lands. If there was one, let's say in the year 536, and he had 6 kids, when he died, that one land was divided in 6. In the 2nd generation, each one of those 6 kids having 2 kids, it was divided again. So in 3 generations, there was no nobility. And at that time, nobility was the ruler of society. Even if when there was a king, it was the nobility that dispatched justice, it was the nobility that ran society, and consequently, the nobility, although not decimated, but was taken care of in Western Armenia, that was under Byzantine rule as well. Furthermore, they invited a lot of these Armenian noblemen who were generals or trained in the army to go to Constantinople and to fight for the Greek army. And there are a lot of families, and there is one line of Byzantine emperors who are Armenian. They are of Armenian descent.
They have Armenian names, but they are now in the Byzantine army, and after a few generations, they are serving the Byzantine court and state. All right, so what we have then, by the 9th century, basically three major families left as the nobility of Armenia, and it is one of these particularly by the name of the Pakradunis, who perhaps were smarter than the others and did not revolt against the Arabs every time there was a chance. They played it cooler, and eventually when the Arabs became weaker, they were able to ask for the crown of the Armenian kingdom for themselves. And when the Arabs procrastinated, the Pakraduni prince said, I'll get the crown from Byzantium if you don't give me one. So Kiev sent one immediately, and then the Byzantine Emperor sent it immediately. So the kingdom of Armenia was reformed. There was a new kingdom that lasted from 9th to 11th century, and this is the kingdom of Pakraduni, of which you saw this last film, the capital being eventually the city of Ani. But this is the last state, the last kingdom we see in Armenia. After that, as I mentioned, from the 11th to the 15th centuries, we have these invasions, incursions, demographic changes which weaken totally the Armenian basis of the land of Armenia. That is, later on, for example, you will find the Greeks revolting against the Turks successfully, the Serbians doing so successfully. And although they will be massacred during the revolt, they will still be able to succeed against the weak Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. Why didn't the Armenians succeed? Well, one of the basic reasons is that their land was not inhabited in a homogeneous manner by Armenians. By the end of the 19th century, through massacres, through forced migrations, through land confiscations, through settlements of Muslim elements from other parts of the country in Armenia, Armenians were a minority in their own land. And this presents not only legal problems in terms of who that land belongs to, but logistic problems as well. When you try to organize a revolution, when you try to organize an uprising, who are you working with? Your next door neighbor is not one of you. And that also presents problems for a lot of Armenians who say, well, it doesn't work. Revolution doesn't work because we're not united, we're not single, we're not powerful in one single place. All right. Now, going back then from the 11th to the 15th century, the nobility is gone. And this is one of the tragedies of Armenian society. That the nobility was taken care of. Not that I'm much fond of nobility as such, exactly for the normal evolution of society, you go from absolutist rulers, kings, to the nobility, and then power starts filtering down to the middle class and eventually to the whole people. But you continuously have a system through which power is expressed and exerted, which is regarded, a system which is regarded as legitimate by everybody. The kingdom, the rule of King Dicronis was regarded as legitimate by all, although in our view it might not have been a good system. The rule of the nobility was regarded as legitimate, so that when it is the nobility that defined what was good for Armenians, and people followed, because that was the system. But what happened in the 11th to 15th century is that the people lost the nobility, and you did not have an urban class, a middle class, a bourgeois society, which could take instead the place of the nobility, like it happened in European countries, in France. The French Revolution was exactly that. The middle class came and said that the king and the nobility can no longer define our needs, our interests. We will define it. We're not an agricultural society anymore, we're an urban society. And who knows better the urban society than the middle class, the enterprising class? And therefore we will define it. But they were organized, they had an economic basis to do it, and they did it. What happened in Armenian society is that there was no longer a state.
ruled either by kings or aristocrats or nobility, to define and to organize that had any degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And therefore, that continuity was lost from the 11th through the 15th century. And it took 3-4 centuries after that break in Armenian history for the lower middle class, for the peasant, to start defining himself and his own interests. And the revolution of which we talked in the 19th century is primarily a revolution of peasants. It is the peasants who can no longer take. It is the peasants who find that whatever they're getting from their land through their own labor is taken over by the tribal society of the Kurds, who are encouraged by the state to roam around the countryside and confiscate everything they see. So that the peasants are oppressed by roaming taxpayers and tribal groups, such as the Kurds. On the other hand, the Armenian city dweller, who wants to use the stability, the relative stability that is there, to develop commerce, to develop manufacturing, not only is not encouraged by the state, but has so many taxes to pay, so many bribes to make to get anything done, that it is unable to develop its own resources. And consequently, in the 19th century, when we find intellectuals, students, youth that come and start organizing the Armenians, it is not the intellectuals who are having the revolution as often is charged, that these are all young kids who don't know what to do. The job that the youth does, or the intellectual does, is just define, formulate the problems that exist. The peasant knows damn well what is the concept of freedom. He doesn't need to read it anyway. He doesn't need to have gone to a European university to know that his wife is being taken away and he can't. You don't need to have all kinds of philosophical arguments to say that when I am working, I am harvesting, why is he eating and my kids are coming? And it is this kind of revolution that started in the 19th century, accompanied by the revolution of the middle class that could not take it anymore, not being able to put together what it had, not being able to increase its not being able to trade what it had. So that it is these two lower classes of Ottoman society that started the revolution against the Ottoman state, which was run still by the Ottoman nobility. And it is this revolution that tried first to function within the Ottoman system. When in the 19th century, some of the Ottoman rulers that were known as the Sultan, as being emperor of the Ottoman Empire, a couple of sultans started reform movements, equality of religion, equality of rights to all the citizens, etc. Armenians were extremely happy. They said, finally we're getting something. But then, immediately after, they went back on their word. Life continued as it was. International treaties were made to improve the life of the Armenians, to reform the life of the Armenians, particularly in the provinces. They are often said that Armenians lived very well. Armenians lived very well when they were not in their country. They were allowed to develop Ottoman trade and commerce in Europe, in Constantinople, in the capital of the empire, but not in Armenia itself. And consequently, when there are often charges that Armenians got the best of the Ottoman system, well, they did it in Constantinople, but these people were not interested in the revolution. The Armenian people were not in Constantinople, the Armenian people were in Armenia. And consequently, when they weren't able to develop, they organized themselves. When they got no solution from the Ottoman state, they realized ultimately that the Ottoman state is only interested in keeping its empire going, and not in the people. They got no recourse from international treaties that were signed for Armenians. There was no recourse from the Russian Empire, which at one point was advancing and then decided couldn't, because England said, we don't want the Russians to go more. What was that? What we do? Well, they said, either way, we are going. That is, we are dying. If we can't live as human beings, as decent people, then we are being massacred slowly. Every few years there were partial massacres.
all the rights being taken away from people, whatever small rights they had. So ultimately, the last recourse was a revolt to try to force the Ottoman state to do something about it, and at the same time attempting to relate to the younger generation of Turks who had seen some better systems in Europe, and who were feeling that the system of the Sultan, the feudal system, was not good for the Ottoman people as a whole. Well, when the Young Turks, as you know, ended up having a revolution in 1908, getting rid of the Sultan, Armenians were with them. They had encouraged them, saying, you have to make a revolution to improve the country, to reform your society, and we are with you. But eventually these same Young Turks who had promised all kinds of reforms for society decided that they will go back and continue the policy of the sultans. And finally, in 1914, when the European War broke out, the Ottoman state, now no longer the Sultan, but the younger Turks, decided that they're going to go into the war on the side of Germany against France and England and the Allies. They wanted also the Armenians, who by now were already divided, right, between Western Armenia, which is Turkey, and Eastern Armenia under Russia. They wanted the Armenians in Western Armenia to convince those in Eastern Armenia under Russian rule to revolt against the Russians, so that Turkish armies could occupy Russia. Well, Armenian leaders told them that, first of all, it is a mistake for Turkey to go into war because it has nothing to gain and everything to lose. Secondly, Armenians who are living in the Ottoman Empire Well, in the case of Romania, Armenians formed a small community there, and although I think a couple of schools existed for some time, for a long time, there have been no Armenian schools in Romania allowed by the government. So, what happens is you have families that have kids that have not gone to Armenian school, that go to Romanian schools, Romanian clubs, watch Romanian TV, and eventually they might have been assimilated to some extent over there into Romanian society, and yet because of the opportunities given to Armenians, then they start moving out here. You will find the same thing in American Armenians. Some of them will say, well, I'm an American, and to varying degrees they will accept Armenianism. Some will accept it as a kitchen phenomenon. You know, you eat Armenian food, that's enough. And others will do, will go to Armenian schools, will be involved in Armenian organizations, political, religious, cultural, social, or whatever. And you have the whole range. Yes.
Is the alphabet related to Russian?
No. It is related to some extent to ancient Greek. In that sense, as to the extent that Russian is related to Greek, you will find some similarities, but not any direct ties. Some of these letters don't even exist in other languages, sounds. Yes. Oh no. No, that's exactly what I was saying. Some of the letters are variants of the ancient Greek alphabet, which was the basis for the Cyrillic, right? But no, you put the two together and you will find very few similarities. You will find some, but you can't say that it is Cyrillic or close to Cyrillic. Yes.
first classes that came over were wealthy, but that the classes that are coming over now are very poor, and the people were used to, the people were used to pilfering in Russia in order to get food or whatever. So the classes that are coming now, there's more of this kind of thing going on, pilfering and things, because it's a lower class that's coming over than what was coming over before. I want to know if that's true.
It's the first time I hear it. I don't claim.
I mean, he wasn't saying
No,
it
no,
to
no,
me
no, no.
either.
I know.
He was saying it in relation to what was happening.
No, I don't know. It's the first time I hear that explanation. There have been no studies, empirical studies to indicate through reliable data that that's the case. It might or might not be. To the best of my knowledge, through people I know who are coming, that's not the case. But I cannot make a judgment on what I know personally. I was in the Soviet Union last year. As a matter of fact, last November 29th, at this time I entered Soviet Armenia after 5 days in the train through Russia, and spent some time there doing research. And the people who were interested in coming, as I said earlier, are those, that is, people who talk about coming, are those who migrated after the Second World War. So it is not a class problem. It's a limited number anyway. So I don't know if you can relate it to class. It is a very logical explanation, but human affairs are not always logical. I mean, it is a hypothesis that perhaps should be investigated. Perhaps there is some truth in it. I don't know. I can't give a definite answer to that.
Well, economically, I mean, I guess an economist could sort of put a into a class, but
Oh, you can.
what economic class?
Oh, you have those who have made it and those who haven't.
But
Yeah.
I mean, what is the people who are coming over now?
The people who are coming over now, I don't know. They belong to the middle class in the Soviet Union. And I'm not saying there's a class division as we understand it here, but there are people whose access to positions, whose position in life is such that they can put aside money. I mean, there's a basic problem. A car, the best. But it's very difficult, since no research has been done, to say that this is the reason or that is the reason. There is no research as to how Armenians are behaving today. Are they behaving any different from Armenians before, or are they behaving any differently from non-Armenians in this society? I don't know. There are all kinds of rumors, but I still have to see anything concrete. Whether you value that culture that is 3,000 years old. He might not know it himself in detail. But the important thing is, after all, is all this martyrdom worth something? This is the major question. And this is the psychology of a victim. And most Armenians have not been able to get out of it. Some have, but most haven't. So you have to, I don't know, I think this is a major, major problem.